The first light of dawn bled across the horizon like a wound, reopening, painting the Caribbean sky in shades of crimson and amber. Captain Coffin Blackthorne stood at the edge of a freshly dug grave on the northernmost point of Isla de los Condenados, the island of the damned. The name had always seemed theatrical to him, a relic of superstitious Spanish sailors who'd abandoned the place centuries ago. Now, as the salt-heavy wind pressed against his weathered face and the smell of disturbed earth filled his nostrils, Coffin wondered if those sailors had known something he'd refused to believe. The grave yawned before him like a hungry mouth, 6 feet deep and wide enough for the pine coffin that lay beside it. Inside that box was Jonas Merrick, the man who'd been his first mate for 12 years, his brother in all but blood, and now his greatest betrayer. The failed mutiny 3 nights prior had left 7 good men dead, their bodies already committed to the deep according to the old ways. But Jonas would receive no such honor. Traitors didn't deserve the sea's embrace. Corvin's crew stood in a semicircle behind him, their faces drawn and pale, despite the growing warmth of the Caribbean morning. There were only 9 men left now, and their eyes carried the hollow look of those who'd seen too much death in too short a time. Miguel Santos, the ship's carpenter, clutched his rosary beads so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Young Thomas Webb, barely 18, kept his gaze fixed firmly on his boots, unable or unwilling to watch what came next. Even Hamish McGregor, the grizzled Scottish gunner who'd survived 3 decades at sea, shifted his weight nervously from foot to foot. The coffin itself was crude work, hastily assembled from planks salvaged from the longboat Jonas had tried to steal. Coffin had insisted on building it himself, driving each nail with methodical precision while the traitor watched from the brig below deck. There was symbolism in that, he'd thought at the time. The betrayed constructing the final resting place of the betrayer. Now, in the strange stillness of this cursed dawn, he wasn't certain whether the act had been justice or cruelty. Inside the coffin, Jonas had stopped moving an hour ago. Coffin had seen the rise and fall of his chest grow shallow, then cease altogether. The poison had worked exactly as the voodoo woman in Port Royal had promised. A slow death, she'd said, painful but not agonizing. Time enough for a man to contemplate his sins before the darkness took him. Coffin had paid her 3 pieces of 8 for the concoction, a mixture of herbs and toxins native to these islands that would mimic death so perfectly that even a surgeon couldn't tell the difference. "Captain." Miguel's voice was barely above a whisper, thick with his Portuguese accent. "Perhaps we should reconsider. The old ways speak against burying a man at dawn. It traps the soul between worlds." Coffin turned his cold grey eyes toward the carpenter. Jonas trapped himself between worlds the moment he raised a blade against his brothers. The sea won't have him, so the earth must. He knelt beside the coffin, placing his weathered hand flat against the rough pine. The wood felt warm despite the cool morning air, as though something inside generated its own heat. Coffin dismissed the thought as fancy. Dead men didn't generate warmth. Jonas Merrick, he spoke the words of the old curse, taught to him by his own captain decades ago, when he'd been nothing more than a cabin boy with salt in his veins and dreams of fortune. You who broke faith with your brothers of the sea, you who raised steel against those who called you friend, you who sought to steal what was earned through blood and storm, I curse you to lie in darkness eternal, neither welcomed by the sea nor embraced by the sky. May the earth hold you fast, may the worms find you bitter, and may your name be spoken only as a warning to those who would follow your path. As the final words left his lips, something changed. The constant Caribbean wind, which had been whipping at their clothes and hair since they'd come ashore, suddenly died. Not gradually, not fading away, but stopping as abruptly as if a door had been slammed shut. The palm fronds that had been rustling overhead fell silent. Even the ever-present sound of waves against the rocky shore seemed to diminish, growing muffled and distant. Coffin felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand upright. Around him, his crew shifted uneasily. Young Thomas made a small sound of distress. Miguel's muttered prayers grew more fervent. "Get the ropes," Coffin ordered, his voice rougher than he intended. Lower him down. 4 men stepped forward, Miguel, Thomas, Hamish, and a lean sailor named Charles Finch, who joined them in Nassau just 6 months prior. They positioned themselves at the corners of the coffin, threading thick ropes beneath it with practiced efficiency, despite their obvious reluctance. On Corvin's signal, they lifted together, shuffling toward the grave's edge with small, careful steps. The coffin swayed slightly as they maneuvered it over the opening. Corvin watched the shadow of the box fall across the excavated earth, a dark rectangle against the rust-colored soil. Something about that shadow seemed wrong, though he couldn't articulate why. It appeared too deep, too solid, as though it had weight and substance beyond what a mere absence of light should possess. "Lower away," he commanded. The ropes hissed through calloused hands as the coffin descended into the earth. It had dropped perhaps 3 feet when a sound froze every man in place. Knock, a single, distinct impact from inside the wooden box. "What in the name of—" Hamish began, but Corvin cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Your hand slipped." The coffin struck the grave wall, but even as he said it, Corvin knew it wasn't true. The sound had come from within, not without. A knuckle against wood, deliberate and clear. "Keep lowering," he ordered, though his own voice had lost some of its certainty. The crew obeyed, but their movements had become jerky, panicked. The ropes didn't lower smoothly now, but in short, uncontrolled bursts. The coffin descended another foot. Knock, knock. This time there was no mistaking it. 2 sharp raps, as distinct as a visitor at a door. Thomas dropped his rope entirely, stumbling backward with a cry of terror. The coffin lurched to one side, held now by only 3 sets of hands. "Hold fast, you cowards!" Corvin roared, but the authority in his voice couldn't mask the ice forming in his gut. Miguel's rope slipped next, and then Hamish's. Only Charles maintained his grip, and for a frozen moment the coffin hung at an angle, suspended by a single rope over the dark earth below. Then Charles too released his hold, and the coffin fell the remaining 3 feet, striking the bottom of the grave with a heavy thud. In the terrible silence that followed, every man heard it clearly. Knock, 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 knock. Rhythmic, deliberate, insistent. The unmistakable sound of knuckles rapping against wood from the inside. A staccato pattern that spoke of consciousness, of will, of desperate communication from something that should have been beyond all such things. The coffin began to shake. It started as a tremor, barely visible in the pre-dawn light. But within seconds, the entire box was rattling in its earthen prison, dirt cascading from the grave walls as the violent motion intensified. The ground beneath Corvin's feet began to vibrate in sympathy, a low rumble that seemed to emanate from deep within the island itself. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God," Miguel whispered, crossing himself repeatedly. "The earth rejects him. The island knows he shouldn't be buried here." The knocking had evolved now into a frantic pounding, no longer rhythmic but desperate, chaotic. Fists hammering against pine, a sound that conveyed panic and rage and something else Corvin couldn't quite name. Something that made his blood run cold and his breath come short. "He's alive," Thomas gasped, his young face gone milk-white. "Captain, he's alive in there." "He's dead," Corvin insisted, but his certainty was crumbling. "I watched him die. I checked his pulse myself before we sealed the coffin." "Then what's making that sound?" Charles demanded, his usual composure shattered. "Dead men don't knock, Captain." The pounding grew more violent, and now they could all see the coffin lid, bulging upward with each impact, the nails holding it shut, groaning under impossible strain. Splinters appeared in the wood. The earth around the grave had begun to crack, fissures spreading outward like a spider's web. Hamish pulled his pistol, pointing it at the grave with shaking hands. "Whatever that is, it ain't natural." "It ain't right. Put that away," Corvin snapped, though he'd unconsciously placed his own hand on the hilt of his cutlass. "You'll do no good shooting at shadows and fear." But it wasn't shadows or fear making that sound. Something was inside that coffin, something that wanted out with a desperation that transcended death itself. The sky above had grown darker despite the advancing dawn. Clouds rolling in from the previously clear horizon with unnatural speed. The sea beyond the island's rocky shore had gone absolutely flat, smooth as glass and utterly still. No waves broke against the stones. No whitecaps dotted the surface. The water simply lay there, lifeless and wrong, reflecting the blood-red sky like a mirror. "We have to open it," Miguel said suddenly, his voice carrying the weight of conviction born from terror. "If we don't, something worse will happen. I can feel it, Captain. The island is angry. We're not opening anything," Coffin growled, though even he could feel what Miguel described. A pressure in the air, a sense of mounting rage from the very ground beneath their feet. "We're going to cover this grave and get back to the ship." He grabbed a shovel and thrust it toward Thomas. "Start filling it in! Now!" Thomas stared at the shovel as though it were a venomous snake. "Captain, I can't, I won't. If he's alive in there, he's not alive." Corvin's shout echoed across the island, bouncing back from the rocky cliffs with eerie clarity. "Jonas Merrick is dead, and we're going to bury him as planned." But as he lifted his own shovel and prepared to cast the first load of earth into the grave, the knocking abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. Coffin stood frozen, dirt-laden shovel raised, listening to nothing. Around him, his crew had gone equally still, every man straining to hear what would come next. For 10 heartbeats, nothing happened. The unnatural stillness persisted, the dead wind, the glass-smooth sea, the oppressive weight of the darkening sky. Then from the depths of the grave a new sound emerged. It was a voice, muffled by 6 feet of earth and wooden planks, but unmistakably a voice. Coffin. The shovel fell from the captain's nerveless fingers. Captain Coffin Blackthorne had faced storms that could tear apart a ship, had crossed swords with Spanish naval captains, had survived fever, starvation, and a mutiny that left him with a scar running from his left ear to his collarbone. In his 43 years, he'd learned to trust his instincts, to read the sea and sky, to know when danger approached before it showed itself. Those instincts had kept him alive when better men had perished. Now every instinct he possessed screamed at him to run. "Coffin!" The voice came again from the grave. Clearer this time, despite the earth and wood that should have muffled it into incomprehensibility. It was Jonas's voice, but wrong somehow. The timbre was correct. The familiar roughness born from years of shouting orders over storm winds was there, but underneath lay something else. Something that spoke of darkness and cold, places far from the sun's touch. Miguel had fallen to his knees, his rosary beads clicking frantically as prayers spilled from his lips in rapid Portuguese. Young Thomas had retreated to the tree line, his back pressed against a palm trunk, as though he could somehow merge with it and disappear. Hamish kept his pistol trained on the grave, though the weapon shook so badly, Coffin doubted he could hit the broadside of a galleon. "This isn't possible," Charles muttered, his face gone grey as ash. "Dead men don't speak. They don't knock. They don't help me!" The words cut through Charles's denial like a blade through silk. They carried a weight of suffering that seemed impossible to fabricate, a raw desperation that bypassed reason and struck directly at something primal in the human heart. "He's suffering down there," Miguel said, looking up at Coffin with eyes that gleamed with tears and terror in equal measure. "Captain, whatever our feelings about his betrayal, we can't leave a man to suffer like this. It's inhuman." "He tried to kill us," Coffin reminded them, his voice harder than the iron nails in the coffin below. 7 good men died because Jonas Merrick decided their lives were worth less than his greed. Would you have us reward that?" "I would have us show mercy where he showed none," Miguel replied. "That's what separates us from animals, Captain. From monsters." A tremor ran through the ground, subtle but unmistakable. Pebbles and loose dirt skittered into the grave. The oppressive stillness that had fallen over the island remained unbroken, but now Coffin could feel something building beneath it, a pressure mounting like steam in a sealed kettle. "Coffin, please," Jonas's voice again, and this time it carried notes of the man Coffin had known, the friend who'd pulled him from the sea during that hurricane off Cuba. The brother who'd sat with him through 3 days of fever in Port Royal, spooning rum and water between cracked lips when Coffin had been too weak to lift his own head. The companion of 12 years and 100 harbours. You poisoned him, Hamish said suddenly, lowering his pistol as realization dawned. That witch's brew from Port Royal. You said it would mimic death, but what if it just slowed everything down? What if he's been conscious this whole time, feeling every minute of being sealed in that box? The thought hit Coffin like a physical blow. The voodoo woman had promised a painless death, but she'd also smiled in a way that suggested she knew more than she was telling. What if the poison hadn't killed Jonas at all? What if it had only trapped him in a state between life and death, aware but unable to move or cry out until now? The idea was monstrous, more monstrous even than the betrayal that had brought them to this cursed island. I'm going to open it, Miguel declared, rising to his feet with the certainty of a man who'd made an irrevocable decision. I won't have this sin on my soul, Captain. I won't stand by while a man suffocates in the dark. You'll do no such thing, Coffin commanded, but his authority felt hollow. The ground trembled again, stronger this time. Cracks spread through the earth around the grave, and from somewhere deep below came a sound like grinding stone. Look at the sea, Thomas shouted from his position by the trees, pointing toward the shore with a trembling hand. They all turned. The Caribbean, which had gone unnaturally still, was changing. But it wasn't resuming its normal rhythm of waves and currents. Instead, the water was rising, not flowing onto the beach, but simply elevating, as though an invisible force were lifting the entire ocean toward the sky. Already it had climbed 3 feet above its normal level, lapping at rocks that were usually well clear of the tide. The island is sinking, Charles said, his voice climbing toward panic. God above, the whole island is sinking. No, Miguel corrected, his carpenter's eye seeing what the others missed. The water is rising. Look at the trees, the rocks. We're not going down. The sea is coming up. Another tremor shook the ground, violent enough this time to knock Charles off his feet. The grave walls began to collapse inward, dirt cascading onto the coffin below in streams and clods. The cracks in the earth widened, and from them came a smell that Coffin recognized from the deepest holds of slave ships he'd encountered. The reek of suffering made manifest, of hope extinguished and replaced with something far darker. Please, Jonas's voice had changed again, taking on a hollow quality that echoed strangely. The darkness is so complete. I can't breathe. I can't move. There's something here with me in the dark, something that whispers. Help me, Coffin. For the love you once bore me, help me. Coffin closed his eyes, seeing in his mind the Jonas he'd known. Not the traitor who'd tried to slit his throat 3 nights ago, but the young man who'd joined his crew in Tortuga 12 years past. 23 years old and cocky as hell, quick with a blade and quicker with a laugh. They'd gotten drunk together in every port from Barbados to Charleston, had buried other friends together, celebrated victories together, survived disasters that should have killed them both. When had Jonas changed? Or had the seeds of betrayal always been there, invisible until circumstances brought them to flower? Captain, Hamish said quietly, and something in his tone made Coffin open his eyes. The old Scot was pointing at the grave with his pistol, but his hand was steady now, his face set in grim lines. Whatever's in that coffin, it ain't the Jonas we knew. I've seen men die, hundreds of them. I've even seen a few come back as something else when dark magic was involved. That voice, those words, they're using what we remember against us. You think it's a trick? Miguel asked. I think, Hamish said carefully, that we shouldn't open that coffin until we know what we're dealing with. Dead or alive, cursed or possessed, Jonas Merrick went into that box as a traitor. We don't know what might come out. As if in response to Hamish's words, the coffin began to shake again. But this time the movement was different. Not the frantic pounding of before, but a rhythmic, deliberate rocking, back and forth, building momentum with each oscillation. The remaining dirt on the grave walls cascaded down in earnest now, half filling the hole. It's going to break free, Thomas whimpered from his position by the trees. God help us. It's going to dig itself out. The sky had gone from crimson to a bruised purple-black, though it was now fully dawn. Lightning flickered in the distant clouds, silent and the wrong color, green instead of white, like poisoned fire. The rising sea had now climbed a dozen feet above its normal level and showed no signs of stopping. The beach where they'd pulled their longboat ashore was completely submerged. Corvin's mind raced, weighing options and finding them all terrible. Leave the island? The sea was behaving in ways that defied nature, and their small boat would be swamped in minutes if the water continued to rise. Stay and ignore the coffin? The ground itself seemed ready to tear apart, and whatever was happening here showed no signs of abating. Open the coffin, face whatever emerged, and deal with the consequences. I'm the captain, he said aloud, more to himself than the others. The responsibility is mine. He strode to the grave's edge and looked down. The coffin was now mostly buried again under the collapsed soil, only one corner visible. That corner was splintered, the wood bulging outward as though tremendous pressure had been applied from within. Jonas, he called down, if you're truly alive in there, if this isn't some devil's trick, answer me true. Why did you try to kill me? Why did you betray the crew? Silence, even the coffin's rocking ceased. For a moment, Corvin thought perhaps it had all been some bizarre hallucination brought on by guilt and lack of sleep. Then Jonas's voice rose from the earth, and this time it carried no pleading, no desperate edge. It was calm, almost conversational, because you were going to get us all killed, Corvin. The treasure you sought, the prize you promised, it was never real. I found the truth in Port Royal, in records you never bothered to read. That Spanish galleon you wanted to hunt? It went down in a storm 70 years ago. There is no treasure. There never was. You were chasing a ghost, and you were going to lead us all to our deaths doing it. The words struck Corvin like a physical blow. The treasure. 6 months of planning, of gathering intelligence, of preparing for the greatest prize of their careers. A Spanish ship laden with Incan gold, separated from its escort in a storm and reportedly hiding in a secluded bay off the Venezuelan coast. He'd staked everything on it. The crew's loyalty, his reputation, his judgment. You're lying, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Check your charts, Corvin. The dates don't match. The ship you're hunting sank before your grandfather was born. I tried to tell you, tried to show you the proof, but you wouldn't listen. So I did what I had to do to save the men. I tried to take the ship away from you before your obsession destroyed us all. Miguel had moved closer, listening with his head cocked. Is this true, Captain? About the treasure? It doesn't matter if it's true, Hamish interjected harshly. Mutiny is mutiny. You don't try to murder your captain and call it salvation, but it did matter, and they all knew it. If Jonas was telling the truth, if the treasure had been a phantom all along, then the betrayal took on a different dimension. Still wrong, still unforgivable, but perhaps understandable in its way. The ground heaved violently, throwing them all from their feet. The grave collapsed entirely, tons of earth sliding down to bury the coffin completely. And from beneath that earthen cover came a sound that froze Corvin's blood, the splintering of wood. Not from internal pressure, but from something tearing its way into the coffin from below. Something's digging up to it, Charles screamed. From underneath! The earth in the center of the collapsed grave began to sink, creating a depression that grew wider and deeper with each passing second. It was as though something below was hollowing out the ground, creating a cavity that pulled the dirt down like water, circling a drain. And from that growing hole came a new smell, not the reek of suffering, but something older, more primal. The smell of deep ocean trenches where sunlight never penetrated, of coral graveyards and shipwrecks inhabited by things that had forgotten what it meant to be human. Back to the boat, Corvin ordered. Now! But when they turned toward where they'd beached their longboat, they found their escape cut off. The sea had risen another 20 feet, and the water now lapped at the roots of the palm trees, less than 30 yards from where they stood. The boat itself was nowhere to be seen, presumably torn away by the impossible tide. We're trapped, Thomas said. his voice breaking on the words. A hand burst from the collapsed grave. It erupted through the earth with explosive force, dirt cascading away from pale fingers that clutched at the air like the talons of some enormous bird. The hand was wrong, too white, too cold-looking, and the fingernails were blackened as though they'd been burned or exposed to intense cold. The hand was followed by an arm, then a shoulder, and finally a head. But it wasn't Jonas Merrick who emerged from the grave. It was something wearing Jonas's face. The thing that pulled itself from the earth had Jonas's features. His square jaw, his broken nose from that fight in Nassau, his dark hair matted with dirt. But the eyes were wrong. They glowed with a faint phosphorescence, like deep-sea creatures Coffin had occasionally seen on night watches. And when the thing's mouth opened, it revealed too many teeth, sharp and irregular like a shark's. "Thank you," it said in Jonas's voice, though now the wrongness was unmistakable. "For the invitation." Coffin's hand went to his cutlass, but before he could draw the blade, the creature moved. It crossed the distance between the grave and the crew with impossible speed, a blur of pale flesh and tattered burial clothes. It seized Miguel by the throat, lifting the carpenter off his feet with one hand, as though he weighed nothing at all. "The curse," it said, turning those glowing eyes on Coffin. "You spoke the words of binding. You opened the door. And now it smiled, revealing rows of those terrible teeth. We accept your offering. We—" Coffin managed to choke out. The creature's smile widened. "Oh, Captain, you buried your friend on Isla de los Condenados. Did you never wonder why it was called that? Why the Spanish fled and never returned? From the collapsed grave, more hands began to emerge. Miguel struggled in the creature's grip, his feet kicking uselessly at the air as his face turned from red to purple. Coffin drew his cutlass, the familiar weight of the blade in his hand, providing a fragment of reassurance in the face of impossible horror. Around him, his remaining crew members scrambled backward, weapons appearing in trembling hands, pistols, knives. A boarding axe that Charles pulled from his belt. "Release him," Coffin commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded men through hurricanes and battles. "Whatever you are, whatever this place is, that man has done you no wrong." The thing wearing Jonas's face tilted its head, studying Coffin with those phosphorescent eyes. Up close, he could see that the resemblance to his former first mate was only surface deep. The skin had a waxy quality, like a poorly made death mask. The proportions were slightly off, as though something unfamiliar with human anatomy had attempted to recreate it from memory. "No wrong?" The creature's voice held amusement. He stood witness to the curse. He helped dig the grave. He lowered the offering into the earth. "Every man here shares in the invitation, Captain. Every man here opened the door." More figures were emerging from the collapsed grave now, pulling themselves up through the earth with movements that suggested their joints didn't quite work the way human joints should. They wore the remnants of Spanish military uniforms, though the cloth had rotted to tatters and the metal had corroded to rust. Their faces were slack, features smoothed away by time and darkness until they were little more than blank masks with those same glowing eyes. "Fire!" Hamish shouted, and his pistol barked, the report shockingly loud in the unnatural stillness. The ball took the Jonas creature in the chest, punching a hole clean through its torso. The impact should have blown it backward, should have killed it instantly if it had been remotely human. Instead, the creature merely glanced down at the wound with what seemed like mild curiosity. No blood flowed from the hole. Instead, something dark and viscous oozed out, more like seawater mixed with rotted seaweed than anything that had ever flowed through human veins. "Bullets won't save you," it said pleasantly, then snapped Miguel's neck with a casual twist of its wrist. The carpenter's body hit the ground with a terrible finality, his rosary beads scattering across the earth. The creature stepped over him without a second glance, its attention fixed entirely on Coffin. "Run!" Coffin ordered his men. "Get to high ground, go!" They didn't need to be told twice. Thomas, Charles, and Hamish bolted for the rocky rise at the island's center, their footfalls echoing oddly in the dead air. The Spanish soldiers, or whatever inhabited their corpses, moved to intercept, but they were slow. Their movements jerky and uncertain, as though they were still remembering how their bodies were supposed to work. Coffin stood his ground, cutlass raised, positioning himself between the Jonas creature and his fleeing crew. "If it's me you want, then face me. Leave them be." "Oh, I don't want you, Captain." The creature circled slowly, its movements now more fluid, more practiced. "Not specifically. Any humans would have served. But you made it so much easier with your curse, your ritual, your friend buried, while technically still alive. That combination of death and life, of betrayal and brotherhood, of love and hate, it created the perfect doorway." "Doorway to what?" "To freedom." The creature spread its arms, encompassing the island, the rising sea, the darkening sky. "This place has been a prison for 300 years. The Spanish came here, desecrated sacred ground, buried their criminals and heretics in soil that wasn't meant for the dead. They angered something old, Captain, something that predates your gods and your religions by millennia. And when they fled in terror, they left behind a crack in the world, a weak point where the barriers between life and death grow thin." More figures were emerging from the ground now, not just from the collapsed grave, but from all over the island. The earth split and opened, disgorging bodies in various states of decay. Spanish soldiers, sailors, prisoners in chains, even a priest still clutching a corroded crucifix. They rose from the soil like grotesque flowers, their movements becoming smoother and more coordinated with each passing moment. "You were dead," Coffin said, still trying to understand, to find some rational explanation for the impossible. "Jonas was dead. I checked his pulse myself." "Jonas Merrick is dead," the creature confirmed. "Has been since about an hour after you administered that poison. But his body, his memories, his identity, those things are still useful. The thing you call death is not the end, Captain. It's merely a transition, a change of state. And in places like this, where the veil is thin, that transition can be interrupted." The Spanish corpses had formed a loose circle now, surrounding Coffin completely. Their faces remained blank, but he could feel their attention focused on him, like the gaze of predators studying prey. The sea continued its impossible rise, now lapping at the base of the rocky rise where his crew had fled. Soon the entire island would be submerged. "What do you want?" Coffin asked, buying time, his mind racing through possibilities and finding none that ended in survival. "To leave," the Jonas creature said simply. "This island has been our prison for far too long, but we cannot simply walk away. The curse that binds us requires compensation, a soul for every soul released. There are 47 of us here, Captain. Can you guess what that means?" Corvin's blood went cold. "There's only 4 of us left. We can't pay that price." "Oh, but you can." The creature smiled that terrible smile again. "One man can die 47 times if you know how to arrange it. Death and resurrection again and again, each time feeding the hunger of this place until the debt is paid. It would take centuries, of course. Centuries of dying and being brought back only to die again. But time moves differently here in the spaces between. What feels like centuries in this place might only be a single night in your world." The Spanish corpses began to close in, moving with synchronized precision that spoke of a single controlling will. Coffin backed toward the rocky rise, blade raised, but knowing it would do no good. "Cold iron couldn't harm things that weren't truly alive, Captain." Hamish's voice echoed from above. "The sea." Coffin risked a glance over his shoulder and felt his heart sink further. The water had risen another 30 feet, and the island was now little more than a rocky outcropping, surrounded by an unnaturally smooth ocean. His 3 remaining crew members huddled at the summit, perhaps 50 feet above the current water level. But the sea showed no signs of stopping its rise. "Your men have perhaps 10 minutes before they drown," the Jonas creature observed. "Unless, of course, you accept our bargain. 1 soul in payment freely given, and the rest may leave unharmed. The sea will recede. The island will return to its previous state, and your crew can sail away with a tale they'll never be able to tell without being called mad." And what happens to the soul you take? What I described. Death and resurrection in an endless cycle, feeding this place until the debt is paid. 47 deaths for the 47 condemned souls, buried here over 3 centuries. It's quite mathematical, really. Almost elegant. Corvin's mind flashed to Miguel's body, lying crumpled on the ground, rosary beads scattered in the dirt. To the 7 men who died during Jonas's mutiny. To Jonas himself, poisoned and buried as a traitor. How much of this was his fault? If he'd listened when Jonas tried to warn him about the treasure, if he'd checked the facts instead of stubbornly pursuing a phantom prize, would any of this have happened? Why me, he asked. If any human would serve, why not simply take one of my crew? Because you spoke the curse, the creature said. Because you performed the burial ritual with hate in your heart and vengeance in your soul. Because you damned your oldest friend to the earth without mercy or forgiveness. That kind of darkness, Captain, it resonates with this place. It makes you particularly suitable. The Spanish corpses were now close enough that Coffin could see the details of their decay. Some had been in the ground for centuries, little more than animate skeletons held together by remnants of desiccated tissue. Others were more recent, their features still recognizable despite the waxy pallor and glowing eyes. All of them radiated a cold that had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with an absence of life so profound it seemed to suck the warmth from the very air. Above, Thomas screamed. Coffin spun to see the water had accelerated its rise, climbing the rocky slope with impossible speed. It was now only 20 feet below his crew's position, and the young sailor had lost his footing on the wet stone. Sliding dangerously close to the edge. "I'll do it," Coffin heard himself say. The words escaping before conscious thought could stop them. "Take me. Let them go." The Jonas creature's smile widened impossibly, splitting its face nearly to the ears. "How noble, how predictable. But I'm afraid it's not quite that simple, Captain. You see, the offering must be made willingly, yes, but it must also be made with full understanding of what you're accepting. You must choose this fate, knowing exactly what awaits you. So let me show you." The creature placed one cold hand against Corvin's forehead, and the world exploded into vision. He saw himself dying. Not once, but dozens of times, each death unique in its horror. Drowning in the rising sea, his lungs burning as salt water filled them, consciousness fading only to snap back as he gasped his first breath in a resurrected body. Being torn apart by the Spanish corpses, their cold hands efficient and merciless, only to wake whole again moments later. Burning, freezing, suffocating, bleeding out, each death crystal clear and agonizingly real. Each resurrection a cruel mercy that promised nothing but another death to follow, and between the deaths, the waiting. Trapped in darkness absolute, in a space outside of time where minutes felt like years and years like eternities. Alone with nothing but his thoughts and his guilt, replaying every mistake and betrayal until the memories themselves became instruments of torture. The visions released him, and Coffin stumbled backward, gasping. The Jonas creature watched with something that might have been sympathy on its borrowed face. "That is what you're choosing, Captain. That is the price of your nobility. Do you still accept?" Coffin looked up at his crew. Thomas had regained his footing, but now clung to Hamish, both of them staring down with expressions that mixed terror with desperate hope. Charles had his eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. These men had trusted him, followed him, believed in his promises of treasure and glory. He'd failed them in every way that mattered, but he could save them now. He could make one choice that mattered, one decision that would count for something in the cosmic ledger of his failures. "I accept," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. "On one condition." The creature's eyes narrowed. "You're not in a position to negotiate, Captain." Nevertheless, Coffin straightened, meeting those phosphorescent eyes directly. "You want your freedom. I'm offering you the key. That gives me some leverage, however small. So here's my condition. Before you take me, you tell me the truth about Jonas. Was he right about the treasure? Was he trying to save the crew, or was he just another greedy bastard who saw an opportunity and took it? The creature was silent for a long moment, and for the first time Coffin saw something like genuine emotion flicker across its stolen features. Not sympathy exactly, but perhaps a kind of recognition, one prisoner understanding another's need for truth before the end. The treasure was real, it said finally. Jonas lied to you as he lied to himself. The records he found in Port Royal were falsified, planted there by a rival crew who'd learned of your plans. They wanted to sow dissension in your ranks, to turn your men against you so they could claim the prize for themselves. Jonas believed the lie because he wanted to believe it, because he was tired of following, tired of being second. The mutiny was always about ambition, Captain, never about salvation. The words struck Coffin with more force than any of the deaths he'd foreseen. Jonas had betrayed him not from noble intentions, but from base jealousy. 7 good men had died for nothing more than one man's wounded pride. And Coffin had killed his oldest friend, however much Jonas deserved it, based on that same betrayal. "Why tell me this?" Coffin asked. "Why give me this particular pain when I'm about to experience so much worse?" "Because you asked for truth," the creature replied, "and because the dead understand that sometimes truth is the cruelest gift of all. Now do you still accept the bargain?" Coffin looked one last time at his crew, at the rapidly rising sea, at the impossible situation his choices had created. Then he looked at Miguel's broken body, at the Spanish corpses that surrounded him, at the thing wearing his dead friend's face. "I accept," he said. "But first let my men reach the boat. Let them get clear of this cursed place. Then you can have me." "There is no boat," the creature reminded him. "The sea took it. Then make one appear. If you have the power to raise the dead and command the ocean, you have the power to provide a vessel. That's part of the bargain. My soul in exchange for their freedom, real freedom, not a promise that ends with them drowning." The Jonas creature considered this, head tilted in that unnatural angle. Then it nodded slowly. "Very well. Look to the shore," Coffin turned, where there had been nothing but water. A boat now floated, not their longboat, but something else. A Spanish launch, old but seaworthy, complete with oars and a small sail. It bobbed on the unnaturally calm surface, waiting. "Hamish!" Coffin shouted up to the rocks. "Take the others and get to that boat. Rode like the devil himself is behind you, and don't look back." "Captain, we can't," Hamish began, but Coffin cut him off. "That's an order." "The last one I'll ever give you. Honor it." He watched as his 3 remaining crew members scrambled down the rocks, hitting the water and swimming toward the waiting boat with desperate strokes. The Spanish corpses made no move to stop them, standing motionless as the sailors pulled themselves aboard and grabbed the oars. Within minutes they were rowing, putting distance between themselves and the island. Only when they were 100 yards clear did Coffin turn back to the creature. "They're safe. The bargain is sealed. Take what you're owed." The Jonas creature's smile returned, and this time there was something almost respectful in it. "A captain to the end. Very well, Coffin Blackthorn. Welcome to eternity." The Spanish corpses moved as one, their cold hands seizing him from all sides. Coffin didn't struggle. He'd given his word, and whatever else he might be, pirate, murderer, failure, he was a man who honored his bargains. They bore him down into the earth, into the collapsed grave where Jonas's broken coffin lay among the roots and stones. The soil closed over his head, cutting off light and air, and the first death took him quickly, suffocation in the dark, just as he'd condemned Jonas to suffer. But this was only the beginning. As consciousness faded, Coffin felt the curse take hold, felt something ancient and hungry wrap around his soul like chains. Death was not an ending here, merely a threshold to be crossed again and again. He died. And then he lived. And then he died again. The cycle began. Time lost all meaning in the spaces between life and death. Coffin Blackthorn died his second death by drowning, pulled beneath the earth by hands that filled his mouth and lungs with soil and salt water until everything went dark. He woke gasping in absolute blackness, the memory of suffocation still burning in his chest, only to feel the cold hands reach for him again. The third death was by violence, the Spanish corpses tearing at his resurrected flesh with methodical efficiency, their fingers like iron spikes that pulled him apart piece by piece. That death seemed to last forever, consciousness clinging stubbornly even as his body was systematically destroyed. The fourth death was by cold, a freezing that penetrated so deep it crystallized his blood in his veins and turned his organs to ice. He felt every cell in his body die individually, a cascade of microscopic extinctions that built into total obliteration. Between each death came the waiting, floating in darkness so complete it had texture, weight, substance. In that void, his mind replayed his life, not chronologically but in fragments, moments of choice and consequence arranged in patterns he'd never noticed before. He saw the boy he'd been, pressed into service on a merchant vessel at age 12 after his father died of fever in Port Royal. Saw the young man who'd killed his first person during a boarding action, the knife sliding between ribs with terrible ease. Saw the captain he'd become, making decisions that sent men to their deaths with increasingly casual authority. And he saw Jonas, not the traitor, not the corpse, but the friend. Jonas at 23, laughing as they divided plunder in a Nassau tavern. Jonas at 30, holding Corvin's head while he vomited over the ship's rail during that 3-day fever. Jonas at 35, standing beside him when they buried Thomas Wainwright, their navigator, after he'd been shot during a raid on a Spanish merchant. How had that friendship curdled into betrayal? When had ambition poisoned the bond between them? Or had the poison always been there, invisible until circumstances brought it to the surface? The fifth death came by fire, and Corvin screamed until his throat was raw and then charred. The sixth by crushing, the weight of the entire island, seeming to press down on him until his bones splintered like dry twigs. The seventh, eighth, ninth, they blurred together, each unique in its horror but ultimately meaningless in the endless repetition. He lost count somewhere around the 20th death. Or perhaps the 30th. Time had no anchor here, no reference point to measure one moment against another. He might have been dying for hours or for centuries. Both seemed equally possible, equally true, but gradually something began to change. Between his deaths, in those floating moments of darkness, Corvin started to notice things. The void wasn't entirely empty. There were presences there with him, not the Spanish corpses or the thing that had worn Jonas's face, but something else, older, deeper, the thing that had created this cursed place, that had turned Isla de los Condenados into a prison for the dead. It wasn't malevolent, he realized with surprise. It was simply hungry, ancient, beyond comprehension and starving for something it had been denied for 300 years. The Spanish had violated its territory, had buried their condemned in ground that belonged to something that predated human understanding of death and divinity. And so it had responded the only way it knew how, by taking what was offered and demanding more. The deaths continued, but now Corvin began to perceive a pattern in them. They weren't random tortures, but a kind of ritual, a feeding that followed specific rules. Each death corresponded to one of the condemned souls buried here over the centuries. Each resurrection was powered by the hunger of the entity that claimed this place as its domain. 47 souls buried, 47 deaths required. He'd known this from the beginning, but now he understood it on a deeper level. This wasn't punishment, it was transaction. Energy exchanged for energy, death traded for life. The balance maintained through suffering that transcended normal human experience. And if it was a transaction, perhaps it could be negotiated. The realization came to him between his 43rd and 44th deaths, in a moment of clarity sharp as a blade. The curse that bound him, that bound all the condemned souls to this place, was based on violation. The Spanish had taken without asking, had imposed their will on ground that wasn't theirs to claim. But Corvin had offered himself freely, had walked into the bargain with open eyes and willing acceptance. That made his sacrifice different. That gave him leverage, however small. The 44th death came by poison, a fitting mirror to what he'd done to Jonas. And as the toxins spread through his system, Coffin focused his will with desperate intensity. Instead of screaming or struggling or simply enduring, he reached out into the darkness, searching for the presence he'd sensed lurking there. He found it. Calling it vast was like calling the ocean wet, true but inadequate. It was a consciousness so enormous and alien that perceiving it threatened to shatter his sanity. But Coffin had been shattering and reforming for what felt like centuries. His mind had been broken and rebuilt so many times that it had developed a flexibility, a resilience that allowed him to maintain his sense of self even in the face of the incomprehensible. "I see you," he thought at the presence, pushing the words out with all the will he could muster. "I understand what you are. You're not evil. You're not even cruel. You're just hungry. The Spanish starved you, imprisoned you, violated your boundaries. And now you're taking what's owed." The presence stirred, acknowledging him for perhaps the first time. It had no voice, no words, but it could communicate through sensation and impression. Coffin felt its hunger like a physical thing, not for flesh or blood or even souls exactly, but for recognition, for acknowledgement, for someone to finally see it as what it was, rather than as a demon or a curse. "I see you," Coffin repeated, "and I'm offering you something different than what the Spanish gave. Not violation, but cooperation. Not theft, but trade. I'll complete the cycle. I'll give you the 47 deaths you're owed. But afterward, you let me go. You release the Spanish souls as well. You take what you need to sustain yourself, but you stop trapping the dead in this place. You stop using this island as a prison." The 44th death finished, and his consciousness fractured into that familiar darkness. But this time, the presence followed him there, considering his words with a deliberation that spanned what felt like decades. When he resurrected for the 45th death, something had changed. The Spanish corpses were still there, still waiting to deliver their particular brand of extinction. But behind them, in the shadows at the edge of perception, Coffin could see something else, shapes that might have been the true forms of the condemned souls. Freed from the rotting flesh they'd been forced to inhabit, they looked almost human, almost. The 45th death was quick, a broken neck, efficient and clean. The 46th took longer, bleeding out from dozens of shallow cuts, each one precisely calculated to prolong suffering without granting the mercy of quick obliteration. And then came the 47th death. Coffin expected it to be the worst, a culmination of all the horrors that had come before. Instead, it was almost gentle. The Spanish corpses laid him in the grave beside Jonas's shattered coffin, arranging his limbs with something like care. The soil covered him slowly, and as the last light faded from view, Coffin felt the presence surrounding him completely. This death came by simply stopping. His heart ceased to beat. His lungs stopped drawing breath. His brain stopped firing its electrical impulses. Everything that made Coffin Blackthorne a living being simply switched off, as though someone had blown out a candle. He floated in the darkness, expecting the resurrection that had followed every previous death. But it didn't come. Instead, the presence spoke to him, not in words, but in understanding that bloomed directly in his consciousness. The transaction was complete. The 47 deaths had been delivered. The balance was restored. But Coffin's bargain had added something new to the ancient equation: willingness, sacrifice, recognition of what this place truly was. That made him not a prisoner but a partner, not a victim but a participant. The presence offered him a choice. He could return to life, could be resurrected one final time and allowed to leave the island with his soul intact. But he would carry the memory of every death, every moment of suffering, every second of the centuries he'd experienced in this place outside of time. That burden would be his to bear for whatever remained of his natural life, or he could let go, could release his hold on individual existence and merge with the presence, becoming part of the ancient consciousness that claimed this island as its domain. He would lose himself, lose everything that made him Coffin Blackthorne, but he would also transcend the limitations of human existence. He would become something older, stranger, freed from the burden of memory and guilt. For a moment that might have been an instant or an eternity, Coffin considered the second option. How tempting it was to simply dissolve, to let go of the weight he'd been carrying for 43 years of life and what felt like centuries of death. To stop being Coffin the pirate, Coffin the captain, Coffin the failure and murderer and friend killer. But then he thought of his crew, of Hamish, Thomas and Charles, rowing away from the island in that Spanish launch, carrying with them the memory of his sacrifice. Of Miguel, dead in the dirt, rosary beads scattered. Of Jonas, dead in the coffin, betrayer and betrayed both. Someone needed to remember them. Someone needed to carry their stories back to the world of the living and tell the truth about what had happened here. Not the legends or the myths or the tavern tales that would inevitably grow up around the mysterious disappearance of Captain Coffin Blackthorne and his crew, but the real truth, the truth of friendship turned sour, of treasure that was real but unreached, of sacrifice that meant something even in a world of curses and ancient hunger. I choose life, Coffin thought at the presence. I choose to remember. I choose to carry the weight. The presence seemed to smile, not with approval exactly, but with understanding, perhaps even with respect. Then it released him. Coffin gasped awake, his eyes flying open to bright Caribbean sunlight. He was lying on his back in soft sand, waves lapping gently at his feet. For a moment, he couldn't process what he was seeing. The sky was blue, properly blue, not the bruised purple-black of the curse. The sea rolled normally, following the rhythms of tide and current rather than rising with impossible malevolence. He sat up slowly, his body protesting but functional. He was on a beach, but not Isla de los Condenados. This was a larger island, with proper trees and the sound of birds calling from the interior. And pulled up on the sand beside him was the Spanish launch, empty but intact. Captain. He turned to see Hamish running toward him from the tree line, with Thomas and Charles close behind. The three of them looked haggard, exhausted, but very much alive. They crashed into him with the kind of embrace that spoke of men who'd thought they'd never see each other again. "How long?" Coffin asked when they finally pulled back. "How long was I?" 3 days, Hamish said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "We rowed away from that cursed place like you ordered. Watched it sink beneath the waves as if it had never been. Thought we'd lost you for certain, Captain. Then this morning the sea just delivered you. Waves carried you right up onto the beach like a gift from God himself. 3 days in their time. Centuries in the space between death and life." Coffin had known intellectually that time moved differently in that place, but the reality of it still staggered him. "The others?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Miguel, Jonas?" Hamish shook his head. "Gone, Captain, all gone." "We're all that's left of the crew." Coffin nodded slowly, feeling the weight of those losses settle onto shoulders that had already carried so much. But beneath the grief, beneath the guilt and the exhaustion, he felt something else, a strange sense of completion. He had paid a debt that went beyond the immediate circumstances of Jonas's betrayal. He had faced something ancient and hungry and come to terms with it. He had died 47 times and come back. He was changed, marked, but alive. "There's something you need to know," Coffin said, gathering his crew close. "About the treasure, about Jonas, about everything that happened. And there on that beach, with the Caribbean sun warm on his face and the memory of countless deaths still fresh in his mind, Coffin Blackthorne told them the truth, all of it. The lies Jonas had believed, the treasure that was real, the curse that had been waiting on Isla de los Condenados for 300 years. The deaths he'd experienced, and the choice he'd made to return. When he finished, the three men sat in silence, processing everything they'd heard. Finally, Thomas spoke, his young voice tentative. "What do we do now, Captain? Do we go after the treasure? Do we return to Port Royal?" Coffin looked out at the sea, at the endless blue horizon that had defined his entire adult life. The treasure was still out there, waiting in that secluded Venezuelan bay. They could gather a new crew, make another attempt, possibly claim the prize that had started this whole disaster. But what would be the cost? How many more deaths would it take to satisfy his ambition? How many more friends would he lose to the hunger that drove men to risk everything for gold and glory? "No," he said finally. "No more treasure hunting. No more chasing ghosts and dreams. We find the nearest port and we sign on with a merchant crew. Honest work, if such a thing exists for men like us. We carry cargo from one place to another, and we don't ask questions, and we don't take risks that might get good men killed." He expected protest, expected argument. These were pirates, after all. Men who'd chosen this life specifically to escape the tedium of honest labor. But instead, all three nodded in agreement. They'd seen enough of curses and death to last several lifetimes. "There's one more thing," Coffin added. "What happened on that island? The truth of it stays between us. If we tell the tale honestly, no one will believe us. They'll think we're mad or drunk or both. But we know what happened. We know what Miguel sacrificed, what I experienced. We carry that truth, and we honor it by living well, by making choices that would make our dead proud. Understood?" "Aye, Captain," they chorused, and in their voices Coffin heard echoes of the men they'd lost. The crew that had once numbered 12 and now counted only 4. They remained on that beach for another day, resting and recovering their strength. Charles fashioned a crude sail from the canvas they found in the Spanish launch. Hamish scouted the island and found fresh water and fruit. Thomas, despite his youth, proved surprisingly capable at fishing from the rocks, bringing back enough to keep them fed. On the morning of the 5th day, since the events on Isla de los Condenados, they pushed the launch back into the water and set sail toward the western horizon, where the major shipping lanes ran between the Caribbean islands and the mainland. With luck, they'd intercept a friendly vessel within a few days. As they rowed, Coffin found himself thinking about Jonas, about the friend he'd been and the traitor he'd become, about the lies he'd believed and the truth he'd never learned. In the end, they'd both been wrong. Jonas about the treasure, Coffin about the righteousness of his vengeance. And that wrongness had cost them everything. But perhaps that was the nature of life at sea, of the pirate's existence. Everyone was always wrong about something, always chasing prizes that turned out to be different than imagined, always discovering that the costs exceeded the rewards. The only difference was whether you survived long enough to learn from your mistakes. Coffin had survived. Against all odds, against death itself repeated 47 times, he had survived. Now he would have to figure out what to do with that survival. The sun climbed higher as they rowed, warm and real and blessedly ordinary. The sea sparkled with natural beauty, unmarred by supernatural stillness or impossible tides. Birds wheeled overhead, and in the distance they could see the smoke from a vessel on the horizon. "Ship ahoy!" Thomas called out, pointing. "Looks like a merchant brig." They adjusted their course, rowing toward potential salvation. As they drew closer, Coffin could make out the flag flying from the brig's mast, British colours, which meant it was likely legitimate trade rather than piracy or privateering. The brig spotted them and adjusted its own course, coming alongside within the hour. A rope ladder was lowered, and one by one, Coffin and his men climbed aboard. The captain of the brig was a weathered man named Richardson, who listened to their story, carefully edited to remove any mention of curses or walking corpses, with sympathy and suspicion in equal measure. "You're saying your ship went down in a storm?" Richardson asked skeptically. "And you 4 are all that survived?" "That's the truth of it," Coffin lied smoothly. "The rest of the crew, the ship, everything lost." Richardson studied them for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll take you as far as Port Royal. After that, you're on your own. And if I find out you're pirates using a sob story to get aboard my ship—" "We're not pirates," Coffin said, and realized as he spoke that it was true. Whatever else he might be after his time on Isla de los Condenados, he was no longer a pirate. That life, that identity, had died somewhere in those 47 deaths and been resurrected as something else. Not anymore. The voyage to Port Royal took 8 days, and during that time, Coffin found himself watching the sea with new eyes. The endless blue expanse that had always represented freedom and opportunity now also reminded him of depth, of darkness, of the spaces between life and death where ancient things dwelt and waited. He knew he would never be able to look at the ocean the same way again. But perhaps that was fitting. A man who died 47 times and come back shouldn't see the world the same way as before. That would be a waste of such hard-won wisdom. When they finally sailed into Port Royal Harbour, Coffin felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Relief to be back among civilization, among crowds and noise, and the comfortable chaos of a thriving port city. Disappointment because it meant his journey was truly over. The adventure concluded not with glory, but with survival. Richardson paid them each a small wage for helping with ship duties during the voyage, enough to get them lodging and a few meals while they figured out their next steps. They found a modest boarding house near the docks and took a room together, none of them quite ready yet to be alone. That night, as they sat around a small table with rum and bread and cheese, ordinary food that tasted like the finest delicacy after their ordeal, Hamish raised his cup in a toast. "To the dead," he said simply. "To Miguel and Jonas and all the rest. May they find better harbours than we gave them." "To the dead," they echoed, drinking deeply. Later, after Thomas and Charles had fallen asleep and Hamish sat by the window keeping watch, Coffin lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of his deaths, drowning, burning, freezing, bleeding. But he also saw something else. He saw the presence, the ancient consciousness that had held him in the darkness and offered him a choice. It was still out there, on Isla de los Condenados, or wherever the island had gone, when it sank beneath the waves. Still hungry, still waiting, but satisfied for now. The balance had been restored, the debt paid, the cycle completed, and Coffin Blackthorne, cursed captain who had buried a traitor at dawn and heard knocking from inside the coffin, had emerged from the other side of death itself with his soul more or less intact. He would carry the memories of those 47 deaths for the rest of his life, would wake screaming from nightmares of suffocation and violence and cold, would see the faces of his dead crew in every crowd and hear Jonas's voice in every quiet moment. But he would also carry the knowledge that he had faced the ultimate darkness and chosen to return, that he had made a sacrifice that meant something, that saved lives that mattered, that in the end, when given the choice between dissolution and the burden of memory, he had chosen to remember. And perhaps, in a life marked by so many wrong choices and failed judgments, that one right choice would be enough. The next morning dawned bright and clear, and Coffin Blackthorne walked out into Port Royal with his 3 remaining crew members at his side. They had no ship, no treasure, no reputation except as survivors of a disaster they could never fully explain. But they were alive. And in the Caribbean of 1718, where death came easily and often, that was worth more than all the Spanish gold, in all the sunken galleons, in all the blue depths of the sea. Their story would never be told in taverns or sung in shanties. No one would believe the truth if they tried to share it. But they would carry it nonetheless, a tale of betrayal and sacrifice, of curses made real and debts paid in full, of a captain who died 47 times and chose to come back for one simple reason: someone had to remember. Someone had to carry the weight. And Coffin Blackthorne, for all his failures and sins, was a man who honored his debts, even the ones that cost him everything.